Well, good evening, everyone. My name's John Highbush. I have the honor, it is an honor, to be the executive director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation, and I want to thank all 17,000 of you for joining us this evening. In honor of our men and women in uniform who defend our country around the world, if you would please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thanks. Please be seated. Before we get started, there are a few special guests we have with us in the audience tonight, and first, I'd like to recognize our good friend Peter Foy, Ventura County Supervisor. Peter, if you please stand. I'd also like to recognize someone in the audience this evening that richly deserves to be recognized, and that is Newt's terrific wife and author, Callista Gingrich. Callista. Callista, I know you won't be giving remarks from the stage this evening, but all of us here are just delighted that you came tonight. I know there are many here looking forward to seeing you afterwards at the book signing with this, your 6th history book for children. So welcome, Callista, and congratulations on your new book. Before I ask our speaker and the speaker to come up on stage, I first want to note just how lucky we are to have him here this evening. As many of you know, it was not that long ago that Donald Trump was in search of the perfect running mate, presumably a man or a woman that represents the best of the Republican Party, a true conservative, an eloquent spokesperson, a bright and terrific mind, a source of inventiveness and ideas, loyal to the cause, and most importantly, able and qualified to carry out the duties of the presidents of the United States if called upon to do so. So some of you may have had the chance to see Governor Mike Pence when he was here just a few weeks ago, and I think you would agree with me that Mr. Trump selected a man for his running mate who has all those qualities and more. We are fortunate to have him on the ticket. But I also want to note that while I have no inside information from the Trump campaign, it was widely speculated at the time that Donald Trump was in search of a running mate that Speaker Gingrich was not just on a short list of those qualified that he considered. Knowing of Speaker Gingrich's extraordinary talents that I've identified as necessary and so many, many more, I have no doubt that Newt came within a hair of being asked to serve. That fact, one that surprises no one here, is a reflection of just how important Newt's voice is in the Republican Party and just how important his standing continues to be today for many millions of Americans in this country. Some of you may have had the chance to read Newt's latest novel, Treason, his 28th book, of which 14 are New York Times bestsellers. I did the math, and I figured out that if each of you here tonight were to buy 137 books, we could ensure Newt his 15th bestseller. So tonight, I want to get you to just dig deep. Actually, what I'd like to do is recommend that you at least buy a few, one for yourself and a couple for some friends or family members for the upcoming holidays. Newt's Treason is the sequel to his previous novel, Duplicity, and it is such a fast and good read that I think it will make it on the bestsellers list with or without our help. When Newt has completed his formal remarks, he has been kind enough to agree to take questions from the audience. I have no doubt he'll be happy to talk about both his book as well as current events. If you've read his book, you already know that the two are somewhat interchangeable, given he has so effectively set forth a plot involving terrorism and national security, something that's on all of our minds today. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you would, please join me in welcoming back to the Reagan Library the world-renowned author, speaker Newt Gingrich.
Thank you, John. It was really nice. Thank you. Well, let me say first that I'm very grateful to John for that introduction. John does such an amazing job of leading the team out here that has created such a great educational and historic institution that it's always an honor to be with you. And so both Callista and I are thrilled, John, to be back and have a chance to talk. And I want to thank all of you. I think we've been out many times. This may be the largest crowd that I've ever talked to here at the library. And I should say in passing, in addition to John's absolutely wonderful proposal that each of you buy 137 copies, you should also think about any grandchildren or nieces or nephews you know in terms of Ellis the Elephant, who is also going to be here tonight with Callista. So, I was thinking about where we're at, and when you stand in the Reagan Library, and you think about his impact, and as many of you know, Callista and I did a movie with our dear friend Kevin Knobloch, who's here, who directed it, on Ronald Reagan called Rendezvous with Destiny. And I worked with Reagan both in the 70s as a candidate and in the 80s as president. You think about how he thought, how he operated, and then you try to place where we are right now as a country in a context of the lessons of Ronald Reagan. And there's several things I've been very worried about, and I thought tonight would be a useful opportunity to talk about them in the context of Reagan's own experiences. Remember, Reagan is very active in the Screen Actors Guild, and in 1947, he has a drink with a friend who explains to him that the friend is not only a communist, but he's a Stalinist. And that, in fact, when the communists take over, people like Ronald Reagan will either go to prison or be shot. And the guy's quite sincere. I mean, we're not quite sure how much he had drunk by this stage, but what Reagan went home from that conversation, and the guy's sincerity got through to him. And he began studying communism. Now, Reagan had been a New Deal Democrat. He had always voted for FDR. He actually cut a commercial for Harry Truman in 1948. He cut a commercial for Hubert Humphrey, who that year was the Reform Democrat in a party in Minnesota which had been deeply penetrated by the communists. And so actually Humphrey, who many of us think of as a liberal, at that time was a liberal, but a liberal fighting against communists. Reagan admired Humphrey's courage in taking on the hard left. And Reagan begins to think about the Soviet Empire and the nature of communism, and he's very active talking about it from 1947 on. One of the points I try to make to people is, it's 44 years later that the Soviet Union disappears. Now, I tell you that in advance because I am as deeply troubled today by the American left as Reagan was by Russian communism. And I think one of the great ironies is that while Reagan was defeating the Soviet Empire, and I was deeply involved in that whole process, None of us who were defeating the Soviet Empire realized the degree to which we were losing the American intellectual framework here at home. And so in a bizarre way, Marxism won in America at about the same rate it was losing in the Soviet Union. A friend of mine was at a dinner one night at Stanford with a group of faculty members in Gorbachev after Gorbachev had lost office and was out on the speech circuit, having been one of the Soviet leaders who actually didn't get shot when he lost. And they're having this discussion. And one of the Stanford faculty is saying, it wasn't Marxism that failed. It was the Russian application. But Marxism itself is a terrific model. And this friend told me that Gorbachev stared at him for a minute and said, you would have to be an American faculty member. He said nobody else could believe that. Now here's the problem, and you saw this with Bernie Sanders' campaign this spring. Because we have lost control of our academic environments, we have lost control of the intelligentsia. It's no accident that a report came out yesterday from the Center for Public Integrity that 96% of the reporters who have donated to Clinton. That's about 24-to-1 ratio. But that's no accident. They are the left. She is the left. They are of the true belief. I mean, who do you think they socialize with? Who do you think they go to dinner with? And so you have this extraordinary gap in America between a leadership elite that has an entire model in its head that it believes deeply. I mean, I don't think Obama is in any way playing games. I think he honestly, sincerely believes a series of principles and values whose only disadvantage is that they're nuts. But I think he, whereas I think Hillary in many ways is much more calculating, but actually I think more radical than Obama. I mean, it is Hillary, not Obama, who spent her childhood with Saul Alinsky and who grew up in the shadow of the greatest radical in American history, a man who dedicated one of his books to the devil as the first great disruptor. And you have to read Alinsky to realize how deeply anti-American and how deeply anti-middle class and how deeply anti-law and order he was. And that's the person from whom Hillary got her real intellectual framework. It's why her entire campaign is one long act of contempt. Why would they obey the law? The law is some bourgeois thing. And they're proving they can get away with it. I mean, Comey has so totally discredited the FBI. It has not been this badly damaged in the history of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And that's how we are. But here's why I wanted to spend a few minutes, and I'm going to talk about this in some depth for a couple of minutes. Because as I thought about coming here to what is in effect a shrine to the capacity of a person who has faith in America to change virtually everything. I mean, those of you who are too young cannot realize that by 1979, 1980, we were falling apart. Our military was falling apart. Our government was falling apart. We had a president who was sufficiently lacking awareness of the world. I'll never forget at Christmas of 1979, right after the Russians invaded Afghanistan, or the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, Jimmy Carter did an interview on television and said, you know, I never believed they'd be this aggressive. Now, he had lived his entire adult life in the Cold War with the Soviets being aggressive, but it hadn't quite occurred to him. You know, we had 13% inflation, 22% interest rates, rising unemployment. The system was a total mess. And people were routinely talking about, can anyone ever be a successful president again? Can anyone make America work again? And I tell you that because whatever happens on Election Day this year, our first recourse as conservatives should be to Ronald Reagan. If Trump wins, our advice to Ronald Reagan, to Trump ought to be, study deeply how Ronald Reagan spent 8 years moving America, defeating the Soviet Union, and rebuilding our economy. If Hillary wins, our message to conservatives ought to be, imagine it's 1977 and you just saw the female version of Jimmy Carter. But don't in any way give up. As long as there are people alive who believe in freedom, freedom is a cause that can still defeat tyranny. And that has to be our view. And I think we have to recognize and develop a whole new approach that we are going to have to fundamentally, profoundly change the entire structure of the intelligentsia of this country. And that includes universities, it includes public schools, it includes the newsrooms, which actually should be called propaganda centers. They're not newsrooms. I proposed yesterday and today, the two sets of numbers that finally clarified everything for me about the news media were the 24-to-1 ratio of donations for Clinton over Trump, and the fact that the Friday that the 11-year-old Trump tape broke, which was also the Friday that the Wikipedia leaks of Hillary's speeches broke, the three major networks spent 23 minutes on Trump, and between them, all three spent 57 seconds. That's, again, almost a 23-to-1 ratio. And it gives you a sense. And so you start every morning knowing that there's a 23 or 24-to-1 propaganda advantage in whatever information you get. The amazing thing is that Trump is as close as he is, and I've said publicly, if we actually had a news media, he'd be ahead by 10 to 14 points. Is that clear? Now, because I used to teach a long time ago, I still retain certain habits, like I cite books and things. And I want to mention, too, an article in a book I really hope all of you will look for. The book is by Charles Murray, and it's called Coming Apart. And its subtitle is A Study of White America, although he actually says he includes Asian Americans in the same study because they're indistinguishable culturally in terms of achievement and the work ethic and what have you. And it's a fascinating book because Murray comes up with the idea of what he calls super zips. And a super zip is a zip code in which people live in the top 5% in income and the top 5% in education. And he says what we're seeing emerge is an American aristocracy of a kind we've never had before, in which people, I mean, to use the California example, he uses Princeton, Harvard, and Yale, but I'll say, you know, people who go to Stanford and Berkeley tend to marry people who go to Stanford and Berkeley so that they can then send their kids to really good schools so they can get into Stanford and Berkeley. And then they can live in nice little super zips where they all look at each other, which is why nobody in the elites understood Trump, because none of them had ever seen The Apprentice. You know, and you kept trying to say, this was the #1 show on television. And they go, really? Yeah, I mean, you know, it certainly didn't rival Downton Abbey in their mind, and they wondered why anybody would have watched it. And it wasn't on PBS, so they didn't know how to find it. I mean, it was very confusing. And Murray's argument is that what's happened is that you now have these decision elites, whether they're the news media, the judges, the bureaucrats, the politicians, the academics. All of these elites live in these super zips. They all know each other, they all talk to each other, they all date each other, and they live in a rarefied world that has no relation to the rest of the country. The parallel, much shorter version by Nassim Taleb, who wrote The Black Swan. He wrote a very short article you can Google in which he talks about IYI, intellectual yet idiot. And he said what's happened, it's a very short article. He says, look, what's happened to us is that all around the planet, people who can take good tests and write essays get into the elite schools, where they study under a professor who took really good tests and wrote good essays. And because they take really good tests and they write good essays, they graduate with really high grades, and they get placed with the right judge or the right newspaper or the right bureaucracy, where they then hire people who take really good tests and write really good essays. He said, now the problem is that this elite group all across the planet have never done anything. So if you said to them, would you write... So Talib goes on and he says, look, you could imagine asking them to write an essay on how to change a tire. And they would Google how to change a tire, and they would put it together, and they would write a really cool essay. And when you read the essay, you'd think, wow, this guy knows a lot. Now, if you said to them, there's a car outside with a flat, and it reminded me of Lynn White's point in his great history of medieval science, that, or Science in the Middle Ages, I guess is its title, that in the late Middle Ages, academics would argue about how many teeth a horse had based on Aristotle, even though outside the door was a horse. But the horse was not valid because the horse wasn't Aristotle, whereas Aristotle was valid even if he was wrong. And so you couldn't get promoted if you went out and counted the horse's teeth, but you could get promoted if you could memorize Aristotle. And that's sort of the group that now runs the country. This is how you end up with a war that we fight for 15 years, do not win, and nobody in the bureaucracy has noticed. Because if they'd noticed, they'd have had to do something. And they can't do something because they have no idea what they would do if they had to do something. And so what they do is they get up every morning and they work through the next project. So currently we're engaged in retaking Mosul. And this will be the great event of the next month. And later on in life, you will ask yourself, and what did it mean? Because everybody who's semi-smart in ISIS looked out at the full massing of military power and said, I'm going to Libya, see you later. And so or they said, I'm going to Germany. And so all of a sudden we'll discover that it's like squeezing a balloon. The terrorists went from this place to this place. Because we have no strategy, we have no comprehension. You just saw in one of the emails that was leaked, the chair of Clinton's campaign regretting that the killer in San Bernardino had a Muslim name, and it would have been so much better if only they'd had an English name. Now, you ask yourself, what level of insanity leads you to start having to say, oh my God, we can't actually say that the person who did the killing was the person who did the killing, because if you thought they were the person who did the killing, then you'd think they were killers. And we don't want you to think they're killers, and therefore we're not going to do that. And this is where we are. This is why at CENTCOM, and by the way, I have still not seen this scandal fully exposed. At CENTCOM, you had 50-some intelligence experts who jointly signed a letter protesting that the general in charge of their section was pressuring them to put in false reports that understated how powerful ISIS was. Now, that's a level of corrupting the bureaucracy and the military that should frighten all of us. It also leads to the following problem. If you're part of this thin elite, and you love governing because if you didn't govern, what would you do? I mean, there are only so many places you can get a full professorship describing what you used to do. And it's fun to govern. It gives you power over people. You have to be important. So you end up in this situation where when something doesn't work, you just lie about it. Or if you know that it is absurd, you lie about it in advance. So you say, you're going to get to keep your doctor, don't worry. Now, everybody on the campaign knew that was a lie, but if you didn't tell the lie, you wouldn't win, and if you didn't win, you wouldn't get to be president. So in order to be president, you had to lie, but it was okay because after all, you don't want to tell the truth and not be president. Or, what do you mean we're going to send $1.4 billion in cash to the Iranians? Do you think we're stupid? Yes, actually, we think you're stupid because you sent $1.4 billion. Or somebody raises the question, for example, if you're sending money to the Iranians while they're buying missiles for the Houthis, and the Houthis are firing missiles at American destroyers, does this mean that American tax money is going to fund people shooting our own ships? Now, even if you're a liberal, that's really stupid. I mean, you don't fund people to shoot at you. It's a clear rule in the art of war, one of the first rules is try not to be stupid. I know it's hard. This is basic stuff. We're getting down to the problem of American government today. You had this remarkable thing. A guy who I actually admire and I feel sad about is Bob McDonald, the Secretary of Veterans Administration. Came out of Procter & Gamble, CEO, smart guy, West Point graduate, genuinely sincere, now totally owned by the bureaucracy. 2 examples. He announces that they have had dramatic changes in the leadership of the VA because over 90 positions have been replaced. Only this morning, USA Today, which actually did the actual work, pointed out, yes, 84 of the 90 were Veterans Administration executives reassigned from one place to another. 6 were outsiders. 6. And that's the American government as it decays and collapses around it in a way that is amazing. The other example I'll give you, that I frankly have become dramatically more radical in the last 10 years, both under Bush and under, because a lot of this was bad under Bush. It got worse under Obama. But a lot of this is a bipartisan collapse of capabilities. And the final example, story 2 weeks ago. After 8 years of talking about fixing the VA, 1 out of every 3 calls to the suicide hotline goes into voicemail. Now, a country, and I don't candidly know how to light a fire under the Congress. I don't know how to get people to take their responsibilities seriously. But a country that tolerates a veteran at 2 in the morning who's contemplating suicide, who reaches out for help and gets a voicemail, there's just something sick about the whole system, and it's going to have to be fixed. Let me, in that context, describe briefly why I wrote Duplicity and Treason. And then I'm going to take questions. But I think you may find it interesting. Callista and I have, in a sense, 2 parallel projects at Gingrich Productions. One is teaching history. So we just did, with Kevin, we did a great movie called The First American about George Washington, putting in context for people and really aimed at younger people to learn about Washington. And we have a whole project on trying to work on that. And we're about to work on a project on women in the American Revolution. Because again, we think we can get a lot of attention and a lot of people who don't understand why they want to pay attention to Washington, but who may decide they want to pay attention to the role that women played in the American Revolution. So that's one area. The second project we have is to try to bring about and educate people into things that we need to know about for national defense, or we need to know about in terms of changing the country. So I've written a book called Breakout, excuse me, that really talks about all these kind of things. We've done a number of other things like that. And so, in a sense, we're constantly working on these 2 zones. And Ellis the Elephant is part of the rebuilding American culture. Since the schools now do such a bad job, we thought we'd start to fill it both with documentaries and with children's books. And then the novels I'm writing are part of a long process. And I'm the longest serving teacher in the senior military. I've taught 1- and 2-star generals and admirals for about a quarter century. So that's part of the background that goes into this. And I wanted to get across, the reason I decided to write these 2 novels, and they may well lead to several more, is I wanted to start getting across how complicated and how dangerous the war with Islamic supremacism is. So in Duplicity, we have a totally patriotic Somali American from Minneapolis who's running for Congress. Totally assimilated, totally believes in America. And his brother is the #2 leader of al-Shabaab, the terrorist organization in Somalia. And you have all of the tension in a family in which there's a civil war of civilizations. And we tied that in then to a presidential campaign. We deliberately picked a female president not because we think it'll be Hillary, but because we didn't want people to say Gingrich is rejecting Hillary. And I do believe we'll eventually have a woman president. I don't think it'll be Hillary, but I think the odds are very high we will get a woman president. After all, if Theresa May is the Prime Minister of Great Britain and Angela Merkel is the Chancellor of Germany, the odds are very high we're presently going to have a woman president. But we then wanted to build the kind of situation that to some extent you saw occurring in terms of Benghazi. So we have the president, to prove she's tough running for re-election, decides to reopen the American embassy in Somalia. Now, Somalia is such a mess that at the present time, if you go to the Australian Foreign Ministry webpage, they urge you not to visit. And they tell you, in particular, don't go to the airport because that's where all the foreigners are, and that's a real target-rich environment for terrorists. The British have an embassy in Somalia, but they actually keep it in Kenya. And they fly in occasionally. They say, hi, I'm the ambassador of Somalia, see you soon. So we have them open the embassy, and then we have a variety of things happen in the embassy. It's overrun. And the administration then has to figure out, was it their fault? 2 or 3 weeks before a presidential election, well, as you can imagine, they conclude it wasn't. And the head of the CIA has to decide, excuse me, am I going to confess what we were doing, in which case I'm undermining the president 3 weeks before the election, or am I going to lie to the Congress, in which case I'm committing a felony? And in the great tradition of Washington, because presidents can always pardon you, he decides, you know, I'm not going to tell the truth. And so you weave all this together into Duplicity, and you can see why Duplicity is the right title. We also picked an action heroine, which may surprise you, in Brooke Grant, who in Duplicity is a Marine captain, and she's an African-American woman. And we did it in part to draw you into the 21st century. To say, you know, we've had 2 generations of male action figures, but we want to say, look, women are in the combat arms now, and if you're a Marine captain, you're a Marine captain. I mean, the Marines are very tough about training, so we pose her as a person, which is a wonderful contrast with the repression of women in places like Somalia. So you have somebody who's out here leading a full life, running real risk, prepared to fight in combat if needed, and you have over here somebody totally suppressed. So that's Duplicity. Then I read a fascinating book called American Betrayal, which is actually a study of what we learned from the Soviets when they collapsed and we had access to their archives. And in that process, we realized that there were probably 500 Soviet agents in the American government in the 1940s. That in fact the Red Scare was not a Red Scare. The Red Scare was a Red threat. The left has been unending in its effort to avoid this reality. It's as recently as an article I saw yesterday on trying to resurrect the Rosenbergs and explain that while they were traitors, they weren't really traitors because they were really framed because of the fact they happened to give all these nuclear secrets to the Soviets. We really shouldn't blame them because there was something else going on. It was actually a family reunion, and we just didn't understand. They happened to bring a lot of nuclear stuff along because you'd kind of do that if you're a physicist. I mean, you have to be a mindless left-wing person to believe this junk. Because we have all the records. We actually have a fair amount of the FBI intercepts that have been decrypted, and it's called the Venona files. We only got about 10 or 15% of it declassified so far, but it's devastating. So it turns out, for example, Alger Hiss, who the left just ferociously defended and always hated Nixon for having proven that Alger Hiss was a communist agent, which the left will tell you he didn't prove because he really wasn't a communist agent, he was really framed. Well, it turns out in the Soviet archives that at Yalta, Stalin had a secret meeting with him late at night to give him the highest medal that the Soviet Union gave to civilians because he had been their most valuable agent in the United States. Now, you would think, if I said this on the Stanford faculty, on the Stanford campus, you'd have at least 5 faculty members writing letters angrily denouncing me as some right-wing fascist McCarthyite who how can you believe Soviet documents? I mean, this is how bad it is. And so I said, as we were talking about what to do next after Duplicity, I said, what if we designed an adventure in which there was one or more ISIS agent at the FBI, Homeland Security, the National Security Council? What would the effect be? How much damage could they do? And so Treason is about treason. And I think you'll find it sobering. I was asked today by somebody who had read the book and found it very frightening. And they said, do I really believe it's possible? I said, yeah, as a historian, of course it's possible. I mean, you have people in ISIS who are MIT graduates. These are not people who wander around on camels watching reruns of Lawrence of Arabia. You know, and so you have to assume that you could be up against, which is, by the way, why Secretary Clinton's behavior with her server and her emails is utterly suicidally insane. I mean, how we could even be talking about this in this country is crazy. So, as Callista will point out, if you want a happy, positive educational experience, spend some time with Ellis. If you want to be scared, read my books. And that's sort of the balance we keep in the family. So, John, why don't we take some questions?
If you have a question, raise your hand. You'll see we have staff throughout the audience, but just please make sure we put the microphone in front of you before you ask your question, because you're on television. It looks like we have a question right here.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The polls, media polls or online polls, what do you believe? I'm having a hard time with this.
Well, I believe, first of all, if you get a week of solid one-sided smear, it does have some effect. And I certainly think that Trump was in some trouble in the 2 or 3 or 4 days after that they hit him. I was very surprised, though, and the polls are bouncing all over the place, because I was very surprised when I did ABC Sunday morning. They had their newest nationwide poll, and the total movement from the previous week was 2 points. Totally different than you're seeing in some of these other polls. I don't worry much about the polls right now for a couple reasons. First of all, in things like Brexit, they were just totally wrong. I mean, every poll, there was no poll in Britain that showed Brexit winning, even on the day it happened. A year earlier, by the way, when Cameron won an astonishing victory, the general consensus of the establishment was that Labour was probably going to put together a coalition government because of the remarkably intelligent center-left model that the Labour minister had created. Labour was annihilated. They were destroyed in Scotland by the Scottish National Party. Cameron followed a strategy of deliberately targeting the Liberal Party districts and wiped out the Liberal Party. The Conservatives came back with an absolute majority, which no one had predicted. And the Labour leader turned out to be nuts. And the current margin between Theresa May and the Labour leader is 70 points. Not she has 70, she has 80 and he has 10. And this guy in the Labour Party can't figure out how to get rid of him because they're really surrounded by people who are, think of a Bernie Sanders who was really left. And that's the British Labour leader. So I would say to you, if you can tell me whether or not African-American voters in Los Angeles are going to turn out for Hillary the way they turned out for Obama, that'll tell you one thing. If you can tell me how many friends you know personally who will tell you privately they're for Trump but will not say it publicly, that's another part of this. Trump will always do better on an online poll. There is a substantial number of people who will not tell an operator they're for Trump because he has been so viciously smeared by the elite media or the propaganda of the left. And so that's a piece of it. Okay.
Right back here.
Hi, Mr. Speaker. This pertains to your opening comments about the media. David Brinkley was my great uncle. His generation of newscasters never, ever once showed their personal politics. They did their job. My question to you is, what has happened to the media since my uncle's day? Is it a generational change?
Yeah, what happened is that a system which was gradually moving to the left just kept accelerating. So, you know, if you want to, it's a little bit like college faculties. I mean, if you go into the average college faculty if you were in the average college faculty as an assistant professor hoping to get tenure, and you walked around wearing a Trump badge, your career is over. So you get a selecting out process, and then people get together in rooms that are filled with themselves. And so you end up, Everett Carl Ladd, who's one of the great analysts of American politics, said he was once, in 1952, he was at a gathering of college faculty in Manhattan the night that Eisenhower won. And it turned out that not a single person in the room had voted for Eisenhower who had just gotten 55% of the vote. And he said to them, do you realize how utterly, totally out of touch you are? If you have a room of 30 faculty, none of whom have voted for Eisenhower, this is 1952. Well, what's happened is the left has gone further and further to the left. So now, you know, it's not adequate now to have, for example, what we want to do, which is women in the American Revolution. Now you have to have a study of transgender turmoil during the American Revolution as defined by 3 blind poets who were all capable of having a full life if only they could have recognized their fullness in their sexual identity. And that then becomes a department. So you don't study Washington, because what did he do? I mean, he only won the war and created the country and launched the Constitution and became first president. But what did he do that was meaningful? Do we know if he was even in favor of transgender bathrooms? You see, reactionaries don't adopt to the issues of 250 years later, and that's how you know they're reactionaries, because he didn't even think about it. And would actually have thought it was kind of weird, considering he was busy fighting the British and was trying to win a war and create a country. But I mean, these faculty now, the faculties now are just sort of nuts. And you have to start from there. And I really liked Talib's article on intellectual yet idiot, because it allowed me to frame people I've never been able to deal with before and just relax and say, I got it. You're an intellectual yet idiot. I understand now why you're saying these things. Hey, it's okay, babes. I mean, that's fine with me. If you want to live your life being totally stupid, I don't mind. And if you want to get a PhD in being totally stupid and be surrounded by other PhDs in totally stupid and have totally stupid conversations while you teach totally stupid classes, fine. The people that bother me are the alumni who give money to sustain total stupidity.
Thank you for your service, Mr. Speaker. As a retired school teacher, I've been in the belly of the beast and have seen it on just about every level in California. The dysfunction, the malfeasance, the ignorance, the out-and-out stupidity is systemic. You said earlier that unless we solve the problem of inoculating impressionable minds with bad ideas, we're in very white water. What is your solution to this, I see, insoluble problem?
Well, this is where I think, and this is the first time I've had parts of this conversation anywhere, because the being in the shadow of Reagan encourages you to think about historic change, and encourages you to think about long struggles, and encourages you to think about saying things directly and clearly, and not worrying too much about how much the elites go crazy. I mean, Reagan's entire career, I doubt if he ever cued once off the elites. Because first of all, they hadn't liked Bedtime for Bonzo. I mean, go back and look at the reviews he got from the New York Times for his movies. I mean, he was already inoculated by the time he became president. You know, he represented middle-class America who loved his movies enough, he earned a great living and had a good time, and they represented some kind of weird group he never understood. So when he got to be president, it turned out the same thing was still true. You know, he could describe being an anti-communist, and they thought that was a weird right-wing fantasy. He thought it was telling the truth. And so he never worried. He literally, like Margaret Thatcher, who would not read newspapers. She said, all they do is confuse me, and and she wouldn't read articles about herself. She said, I know me better than the reporter. Why would I spend time reading about me by some guy who doesn't know me? I mean, you know, so I think you start there. I think what we have to do, and we're right at the edge of a breakthrough, because I just passed 750,000 people who are now signed up for Facebook. and I do Facebook Live now 4 or 5, 6 times a week. I think we have to decide to create sort of a university of factual accuracy that is entirely freestanding, that doesn't worry about accreditation, doesn't worry about, and just, I did this in some of you may remember, in 93 and 95, I taught a course on renewing American civilization, and we had a conservative who owned a cable chain back then, and he put me on every Saturday morning on his cable stations around the country. And we had about 100,000 people take the class. And I still have people who come up to me today who remember the classes we taught on renewing American civilization, which led to the contract with America and led to a best-selling book called To Renew America. So I'm thinking that a group of us have to have the nerve to reach out to everybody and then to start figuring out how you pick the right fights. And part of it, frankly, is with alumni. I mean, when alumni, I always tell all these multimillionaires, you know, you're paying faculty to teach your grandchildren to despise you. Now, as long as that makes you happy, keep doing it. But then don't come and complain to me that your grandchildren are learning stuff that you know is crazy, because you're paying for it. And I say the same thing to faculty, to the state legislature. Now, of course, in California, trying to talk about reality to your state legislature may be, you know, that will be a lagging indicator of the nationwide fight, okay?
Back here, yeah.
Hi, oh, sorry. Hi, I'm
The
David.
guy back behind you.
Hi, I'm David. I believe that marriage is between a man and a woman. What can be done to defend religious liberty? Thank you, sir.
Well, I think that's a cultural fight that you have to win one person at a time. And one of the great challenges in America, we've had several periods of great awakenings that were revivals that profoundly changed the country. We had one of them in the 1730s and 40s, which set the stage for the American Revolution. We had one in the 1830s and 40s that set the stage for the Civil War. And a lot of that has to be done, frankly, by people in their places of religious belief, and has to become a conversation we have that's cultural, not political. And I think that it's very, very important. I'm very concerned. There's a commission on transgender language in Massachusetts. It's a state government commission, which is talking about what language, what kind of pronouns should you be allowed to use. And I can imagine them at some point deciding that the term "our Father" is by definition inappropriate and reactionary, and therefore the Lord's Prayer should now have a new opening, which, considering that it was, from a Christian belief standpoint, it was given to us directly from Christ, I find the idea of a group of Massachusetts nutheads deciding that they will erase what Christ wanted as that's a good example of how sick the country's gotten culturally.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for coming. I would like for you to explain, especially to the millennials, about the Six Sigma Black Belt program. My late husband was a Six Sigma Black Belt, and how President Trump would hire thousands of these college graduates to help work in all government agencies to reduce waste, fraud, and abuse.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I studied under Edwards Deming when he was 90. I took a tutorial, about 60 hours with him. And he was the person who created the modern quality movement, and the award in Japan for the best managed company is called the Deming Award. And Six Sigma is a particular variation on how you build a quality-oriented system. The challenge will be, and I just talked to a Washington Post reporter today and had a very interesting conversation about this. The challenge will be what we saw happen with Scott Walker in Wisconsin. You cannot fix the current bureaucracies until you fix the civil service laws. It currently takes 66 steps to fire a teacher in New York City. So no matter how bad they are, the process is multi-year and exhausting, and principals just won't go through it. In Baltimore, 13% of the 8th graders pass their math and science exam. We pay about $139,000 for one student in Baltimore to pass their math exam, because you're paying for the other 87% who aren't passing the exam. The potential of you reforming the Baltimore schools is zero, because the unions that surround them, if you think of large public schools, Detroit, Baltimore, Chicago, as instruments for delivering money to people who belong to the union, they are 100% effective. If you think of them as engaged in educating children, they are tragedies, and they are destroying children, and they create the environment in which the riots occur because they produce kids who have no future, no education, no capacity to perform in the modern world, and we tolerate it. So I would say to you, I think Trump would bring in people who are good at managing, but I think if he's serious, his first big fight will be to overhaul the civil service laws so that if you have people to create accountability. So if you find the person in LA who deleted 3,000 appointments for veterans, literally deleted 3,000 appointments so that their list looked better. And some of those veterans may have died because they didn't get to see the doctor. Well, we should have an ability to hold that person accountable. And that's true across the board. If you combine bringing in people who understand Six Sigma with reforming the Civil Service Acts, you could, within a year, have a revolution in the cost and the efficiency and the effectiveness of the U.S. government.
Right here.
Thank you for coming, Mr. Speaker. Okay. In your opinion, how do we bring the Republican Party together to have Mr. Trump win the election?
That's a really good question. I commend you for having the courage to get up and ask it. I would say that the key is to focus on Hillary, not on Trump. I don't ask any Republican to go out and defend Trump, because frankly there are days when Trump says things that I'm not going to go out and defend. But every time I start to get irritated with Donald Trump, I think about the most corrupt, the most dishonest, the most dangerous, and the most radical person ever to be nominated by a major party. And I look at the Supreme Court. What I would say to any Republican who's confused, and I would include in this people like John Kasich, is you tell me how you can justify allowing Hillary Clinton to change the U.S. Supreme Court for the next 40 years. You tell me, given everything we've learned from WikiLeaks about the depth and scale of their corruption, their anti-Catholic bigotry, their willingness to dump Israel, you just look at the stuff that's in those leaks. You tell me how you can tolerate it. And I would say, I'm not asking you to be for Donald Trump, but I'm saying no person who thinks they're Republican can sit idly by and allow Hillary Clinton to walk into the White House. And that means the only practical vote is a vote for Donald Trump.
We have time for one last question here. Yes.
Hello, Mr. Speaker. I'm Tina Hillstrom, and nice to see you and Callista again. I met you at the RNC as a delegate from California. And as a social media expert on Facebook and Twitter, and I say that because I'll spend 8 hours a day tweeting about Hillary and her corruption, Donald Trump, and how he can really rally again. And sometimes I get frustrated, but then I come back through again, and it's all about America. I'm asking you, why, when the papers are so corrupt, and even though they don't have the readership they used to like they do, and believe me, Facebook and Twitter is far superior to getting the word out than the newspapers today, but why doesn't Donald Trump take a few of his dollars, or the RNC, and buy a page on the front, in the middle, in the sports section, every frickin' day, and inform the people?
Well, you mean buy in the newspapers? I don't know that I could, in all honesty, recommend to Donald Trump paying 1 penny to the New York Times for anything. I frankly like the first half of what you said better. I think what he ought to do is dramatically expand his reach through Facebook and Twitter and other social media, and simply, and he's done a fair job of this. I mean, he's in a stand-up knockdown fight with the entire news media, and they are not exactly defeating him yet. I mean, I think he has done a remarkable job, and I think he's got like 25 million followers between Facebook and Twitter combined. But I also think that we have to be prepared to be very direct about how bad, how dishonest, and how propagandistic these organizations are. And when they come up with their next smear, we need to go straight at them and say, yes, this is a smear. As opposed to, oh, gee, I feel bad. I wonder how I can explain the latest truly stupid thing that you invented. And I really do believe, again, nobody in the news media is going to cover the fact that the largest single funder of the New York Times now is the richest man in Mexico. So how do you think the New York Times is going to feel about controlling the southern border? I'll leave you this last example because I think it's the most amazing example of the news media, the propaganda media, deliberately trying to protect Hillary. One of the WikiLeaks on the day that they refused to cover it was a secret speech to a Brazilian bank which paid Hillary $225,000, having paid her husband $400,000 8 months earlier. And in this secret speech, she says to the Brazilian bankers, my dream, now dream is a big word, my dream is a Western Hemisphere without borders. Now, you look at MS-13 gangs in El Salvador, the most dangerous country in the world. You look at the Mexican drug cartels. You look at the Colombian cocaine cartels. You realize that there are 600 million people who live in her new open border. And you ask yourself a common sense question, not a hostile question, a common sense question. The Clinton State Department opposed raising the Haitian minimum wage from $3 a day, not an hour, $3 a day, to $5 a day on behalf of a Korean textile manufacturer. Now, you're a Haitian who's just gone through your second great natural disaster in 6 years. Hillary creates an open border. You can earn, under Hillary's rules, $15 an hour in the US, or $3 a day. You might well have 80% of Haiti decide that they love Hillary. They think she has a great idea, and they'd all like to move in next to her house in New York. I mean, my point is, this is a woman who in private says things that are madness. They have no thought. They're constantly trying to reach out and pander to whoever's paying her next. And I will tell you, and I have not ever said this about any other candidate, I am genuinely frightened of a Clinton presidency in the deepest sense. Thank you all very, very much.